The message arrived on a Tuesday. Not that the aliens knew what Tuesday was. Not that they cared. To the Galactic Council, Tuesday was just another rotation of an unremarkable blue planet orbiting an average yellow star at the unfashionable edge of the Orion Spur. But for Commander HFY Reyes, sitting in the cramped communications bay of the United Earth Diplomatic Station Perseverance, Tuesday was the day everything changed. The signal had been bounced through 17 relay buoys before it reached her console. It was encoded in Galactic Standard, a language Earth linguists had spent 40 years learning, and it was addressed not to any specific person, but to the human collective Sol system, third planet. As if humanity were a single organism. As if Earth were simply a location, not a civilization. Reyes read it once, then again. Then she set down her coffee, which was getting cold anyway, and read it a third time. By unanimous resolution of the Galactic Council, representing 47 recognized spacefaring civilizations, the human collective is hereby issued a compliance directive. You will cease all military vessel construction beyond Class 3 designation. Surrender all research pertaining to fold space propulsion technology. Submit all colonial outposts beyond the Sol boundary to Council oversight. Compliance must be demonstrated within 30 standard cycles. Failure to comply will be interpreted as an act of aggression against the Council and its member states. At the bottom, a seal, 47 species stamped in gold. Reyes stared at it for a long time. Then she opened a secure channel to Earth. What followed, the galaxy would later describe as the most pivotal 72 hours in interstellar history. Earth's Global Security Council convened within the hour. The session was classified at the highest level: no press, no public broadcast, no leaks. The Prime Director sat at the head of a long obsidian table, flanked by generals, diplomats, scientists, and one elderly historian named Dr. Yuan Bao, who had been dragged out of semi-retirement in Shanghai because someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had the good sense to know that this moment needed context. The generals spoke first, as generals do. Numbers were thrown across the table like weapons: fleet strength, projected timelines, logistical chains. The Galactic Council's armada, if deployed, would be formidable. Not invincible. Humanity's military architects had run the simulations hundreds of times, but formidable enough that a conflict would be devastating on both sides. The diplomats spoke second. They proposed counteroffers, measured concessions, a carefully worded response that would buy time, preserve dignity, and open back-channel negotiations. Standard procedure. The kind of response that had kept smaller crises from becoming larger ones throughout Earth's long political history. Then Dr. Yuan Bao cleared his throat. He was a small man, thin-wristed, with white hair and glasses that he insisted on despite the availability of corrective surgery. He had spent 60 years studying the history of ultimatums, how empires issued them, how nations received them, what happened next. His doctoral thesis, The Architecture of Surrender, was required reading at 3 military academies. He had seen this moment before. Not this exact room, not these exact faces, but this moment. He had seen it in the archives of 100 civilizations across human history. He stood up, which surprised people, because he rarely stood for anything anymore. "May I?" he said, gesturing toward the display screen at the center of the table. They let him speak. He pulled up no charts, no statistics, no projections. He simply stood there and told them a story about every civilization in human history that had ever issued an ultimatum to another people expecting submission and received something else entirely instead. He spoke for 22 minutes. The room was completely silent. When he finished, he sat back down and folded his hands. "The Council," he said quietly, "has made a very old mistake. They have looked at how long we have been in space and assumed that is how old we are. They do not understand that we have been at war, at diplomacy, at survival, for 10,000 years before we ever looked up and wondered what was out there." He paused. "They have not issued this directive to a young species. They have issued it to the oldest warriors in this galaxy who simply haven't introduced themselves properly yet." The room was quiet for a long time after that. The debate that followed lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Arguments went back and forth across the table with the weight of history behind every word. And when the final vote was called, not just from the Security Council, but from a rapid emergency referendum sent to every corner of Earth's government, the result was not close. They would respond. One word. Drafted by committee, approved by referendum, transmitted by Commander HFY raised herself from the communications bay of the Perseverance with hands that did not shake, bounced across every diplomatic frequency, every public channel, every relay buoy between here and the Council's home system, broadcast so that all 47 species could receive it simultaneously, in Galactic Standard, in a tone so calm it was almost polite. No. In the Council chamber on Veth Prime, a vast, cathedral-like structure of polished stone and bioluminescent panels that had stood for 400 years, the response arrived mid-session. The translation matrices processed it in under a second. No. One syllable. No counterproposal, no negotiation, no fury, no fear. Just a single, quiet, immovable syllable delivered with the kind of composure that made it somehow more alarming than any threat could have been. Grand Arbiter Solen of the Lethani, a towering, silver-skinned being who had presided over the Council for 3 decades, read the word on the display screen above the chamber floor, then read it again. Her secondary eyes, the ones that tracked peripheral movement, scanned the room instinctively, looking for something to make sense of what she was seeing. The chamber erupted. 47 delegations, hundreds of representatives, voices in a dozen different frequencies and registers, all of them talking at once. Some were furious, some were confused, some, a small number, notable because of how quiet they stayed, were something else entirely. Something that looked, if you knew where to look, almost like respect. In her shuttle, parked in a holding orbit 2 light minutes from the station, Commander HFY listened to the chaos bloom across the open diplomatic channels. Species that had never agreed on anything were suddenly agreeing on their outrage. She monitored the signals with one ear, sipping her reheated coffee with one hand, and with the other she was already drafting the follow-up report for Earth. Council response, as expected, she typed. Recommend maintaining radio silence for 48 hours. Let it breathe. She hit send. Then she looked out the viewport at the stars, ancient, indifferent, beautiful, and thought about Dr. Bao's 22 minutes of quiet, devastating history. The Council thought they had summoned a young species to heal. What they had actually done, Ray's thought, was wake something up that had been patient for a very, very long time. She finished her coffee. Tuesday was turning out to be quite a day. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 12 hours after humanity's response arrived. By that point, the word no had already traveled, not just through official channels, through everything. Merchant frequencies, scientific relay networks, civilian communication bands. Species that had no diplomatic stake in the matter had picked up the transmission and passed it along with the particular enthusiasm reserved for events that are either catastrophic or extraordinary, and nobody was quite sure yet which this was. On 17 different worlds, the story was already being told in bars and markets and living spaces that had no human equivalent. A young species, an ultimatum from the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, and one word delivered without flinching. Inside the Council chamber, the mood was less romantic. Grand Arbiter Solen called the session to order 3 times before the noise subsided enough for her to be heard. The chamber was full, every delegation present, aides packed along the upper galleries, security personnel stationed at every entrance. It felt less like a diplomatic session and more like the moments before a storm breaks. We will have order, Solen said, and her voice carried the particular harmonic resonance of her species that, in their culture, signified absolute non-negotiation. The room quieted. We will assess the situation calmly. We will not allow one word from a border civilization to destabilize 400 years of council governance. Elder Delegate Emran of the Vorthaki, the oldest species in the chamber, whose civilization had been spacefaring when humanity was still carving symbols into cave walls, unfolded his long body from his seat and spoke without being recognized by the chair, which was his ancient privilege. "We should begin," he said in his slow, considered way, "by understanding what we are dealing with. I suggest we review what we know about the humans." What followed was the most consequential intelligence briefing in Council history, and it was, in almost every important way, catastrophically wrong. The files on humanity were extensive. Earth had been under passive observation for nearly 2 centuries, since the first detectable signs of early radio technology had reached Council listening posts. The files cataloged population, industrial output, territorial expansion, and biological data with the kind of meticulous detail that made them look authoritative. They were color-coded, cross-referenced, and presented on a display screen large enough to cover an entire wall of the chamber. They were also, the Council was about to discover, built almost entirely on misreading. The first file, biological assessment. Humans were soft-bodied, warm-blooded, and remarkably fragile by galactic standards. Their skeletal structure offered minimal protection. Their skin provided almost no defense against environmental hazards. Their lifespan, even with modern medicine, was short compared to most Council species. The Lethani, for reference, lived roughly 400 Earth years. The Vorthaki had individuals currently alive who predated human writing. Against this backdrop, humanity looked like a mayfly, brief, bright, and easily extinguished. What the file did not note, a species that is fragile and short-lived and survives anyway, has spent every generation in a brutal, relentless war against entropy. Humans did not reach the stars because their environment was kind to them. They reached the stars despite the fact that it wasn't. The second file, conflict history. This one at least the Council had partially right. They knew humanity had a violent past. What they had interpreted this as was instability, a sign that humans were emotionally volatile, prone to impulsive aggression, and therefore manageable through firm, clear dominance hierarchies. Apply pressure from above, and the organism submits. It was how the Council had integrated 17 other young species over the centuries. What the file failed to capture was the more important truth buried in that same conflict history. Humanity had been at war with itself, not with some external predator, but with its own nations, tribes, and ideologies for 10,000 years, and had emerged from it not fragmented but unified, not traumatized into submission but educated. Every war had been a lesson. Every defeat had been a curriculum. The species that arrived in space was not the species that had started. It was something that had been tested in the only laboratory that matters, reality, and had kept passing. The third file, technological development. The Council's analysts had charted humanity's rate of technological progress and found it impressive but unremarkable, faster than some species, slower than others. What their models failed to account for was the shape of human technological development, not a smooth curve, but a series of explosive leaps driven by crisis. Humans did not innovate on schedule. They innovated when they needed to, and they were extraordinarily good at needing to. Elder Delegate Imran listened to all of this being presented and said nothing for a very long time. When he finally spoke, he did not address the data. He addressed something older than data. "I have lived," he said slowly, "for 912 of their years. I have seen species come into space young and frightened and reach for power before they were ready. I have seen species come in slowly, carefully, diplomatically. I have seen species come in with weapons first." He paused. "I have never seen a species come in the way humans have." "And how is that?" Solin asked. "Quietly," he said. "They have been here for 200 years. They have said very little. They have watched everything." He folded his long fingers together. "I have been watching them watch us, and I have become very concerned about what they have learned." The room was quiet in a different way after that. Not the quiet of disbelief. The quiet of people beginning, slowly and reluctantly, to revise. Across the chamber, in the delegation box reserved for the Vreth, a species of insected beings from a cold world called Acel Prime, who had joined the Council 60 years ago, and had spent most of that time being politely ignored. A delegate named Kessel sat with their mid-limbs folded in the posture their species used for deep concern. Kessel had studied humanity for 30 years, not officially, personally. They had learned English, which was harder than Galactic Standard and more interesting. They had read human history, human literature, human philosophy. They had watched human political broadcasts with the obsessive attention of someone who had found, in an alien species, something they recognized. When the intelligence files were displayed on the chamber wall, Kessel read each one and felt the particular unease of watching someone confidently walk toward a door they do not know is locked. After the session, they would do something unprecedented. They would contact Commander HFY Reyes directly. Reyes received the message during her second coffee of the day, which was now also getting cold. It was brief, text only, no official seal. The sender ID was deliberately obscured, but the Galactic Standard was flawless and the tone was unmistakable. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had decided to do it anyway. Commander Reyes, I am a council delegate. I will not give my name in this message. I want you to know 3 things. First, 3 of the 7 elder delegations are already in private military planning sessions. Second, the intelligence files your council has been assessed by our wrong in ways that are dangerous to both our peoples. Third, you have more allies here than you know. Be patient, be careful, do not blink. Reyes read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Earth with a single line of her own, added at the bottom. Someone on the inside just blinked first. It wasn't us. History, Dr. Yuan Bao had always believed, was not made in the moments everyone remembered. It was made in the moments just before, the held breath, the decision that hadn't announced itself as a decision yet, the room where something shifted, quietly, permanently, before anyone had a name for what had shifted. He was thinking about this on the morning Earth's response was transmitted, sitting in the small garden behind his Shanghai apartment, watching the light move across his tea, listening to birds that had no idea the world had just changed. When his comm unit began ringing with the particular insistence of people who needed him to explain himself. He let it ring for a while. Then he picked it up, because he was a historian and not a monk, and the past needed someone to carry it forward. The requests came from everywhere at once. Journalists wanted quotes. Policy analysts wanted context. 3 separate government offices wanted him in person. A documentary crew showed up outside his apartment gate within 4 hours of the transmission going public, which he found both impressive and mildly horrifying. He agreed to speak to one person, a young policy researcher named Daniar Saitkali, 29 years old, from Almaty, who had written him a letter 3 years ago about his book, and asked a question so good that Bao had kept the letter in his desk drawer ever since. Saitkali arrived with a recorder and the careful, attentive energy of someone who understood they were in the presence of something important. They're calling it reckless, Saitkali said, before he'd even sat down. Half the global feeds are running crisis alerts. People are frightened. There are analysts saying we've just handed the council justification for military action. There are always analysts saying things, Bao said pleasantly. He poured tea without asking if Saitkali wanted any, because he'd found that people who didn't want tea said so, and people who needed it never asked. What do you think? Saitkali paused. I think, and I want to say this carefully, that whoever chose that word chose it very deliberately. It isn't aggressive. It isn't a threat. It isn't even particularly emotional. It's just closed. Yes, Bao said and smiled for the first time all morning. That's exactly right. He settled back in his chair and looked out at the garden. Do you know what the most powerful word in any language is? He asked. Not in a dramatic sense, practically, functionally. Saitkali considered, no. Bao confirmed. Not as a question, as an answer, no. Do you know why? He didn't wait for a response, which was a habit of his that students had found infuriating and colleagues had found endearing, because every other response opens a negotiation. We cannot comply at this time, negotiation. We request reconsideration, negotiation. We partially accept, but negotiation. Even never is a negotiation because it implies that the question of when was valid in the first place. He picked up his tea. But no, just no, plainly and completely is not a negotiation. It's a position. It's a wall, it says. The conversation you are trying to have does not exist. We are not discussing terms. We are not discussing timelines. There are no terms. This is where we stand. Saint Kali leaned forward. But doesn't that make conflict more likely, if you leave no room for the other side to save face? It makes certain kinds of conflict less likely, Bao said. Specifically, the kind where you concede something small today, and something slightly larger tomorrow, and something slightly larger the day after that, until one morning you look up and realize the concessions have become the surrender, and no one can point to the moment it happened. He set his cup down. I have spent 60 years studying what happens when powers issue ultimatums. Do you know what I have found? An ultimatum is almost never really about what it says it's about. What is it about? It's a test, Bao said. The content barely matters. The Council does not actually need our fold space research. They have their own. They do not actually need to oversee our colonies. They are too far away to administrate them effectively. What they need, what they were really asking for, was to know what kind of species we are. Are we the kind that looks up at something bigger than ourselves and reaches for accommodation? Or are we the kind that looks up, measures the distance, and holds our ground? He looked at Saint Kali steadily. Because those two species get treated very differently in the long run. The first kind gets managed, guided, kept at a certain level of development that's convenient for whoever is above them. History is full of that pattern, not just in space, right here on Earth in every era. The powerful issue the test. The answer you give in the first moment sets the terms of the relationship for everything that follows. He paused. We didn't give that answer in anger. We didn't give it in pride. We gave it calmly, correctly, and on the record, because we have 10,000 years of knowing exactly what that test is and exactly what the right answer looks like. Saint Kali was quiet for a moment. What if they don't understand that? What if to them it just looks like defiance? Then we will explain it to them, Bao said serenely, over time as equals. Outside, the birds were still singing. The light had moved across the garden the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful, while history reorganized itself quietly beneath it. 7 days after the transmission, something unexpected happened. Not a military maneuver, not a diplomatic escalation, something smaller and in the long accounting of what followed, far more significant. The Orium, a species of avian beings from a world called Shao, with iridescent feathers and a cultural tradition of recording history through song, made contact with Earth's open diplomatic channel, not through the Council, independently, directly. Their message was short. In rough galactic standard, slightly garbled by the translation matrix, it said approximately, "We have heard your word. We have many questions about your species. We would like to talk if you are willing, not as council business, personally." Earth's diplomatic office debated for 3 hours whether to respond. Reyes, who had been copied on the message, sent a single-line recommendation that cut the debate short. They're not asking for a treaty. They're asking for a conversation. Say yes. Earth said yes. And in a council chamber 3 star systems away, in the delegation box of the Vreth, Kessel received a private notification that 2 more species had begun making quiet, independent inquiries about humanity. They noted it in their personal log, with the practiced restraint of someone who had been waiting a long time to note exactly this. It begins, they wrote. Humanity said one word, and the Council is already coming apart at the seams. They spent 400 years pretending weren't there. The Galactic Council had not survived 400 years by being fragile. It had survived by being, when necessary, ruthlessly unified. Disagreements happened, they always happened, but they happened behind closed doors, in private sessions, in the careful language of species who had learned the hard way that public fracture was an invitation to chaos. The 47 member civilizations had different biologies, different histories, different values. What held them together was not love. It was not even respect. It was the shared understanding that the structure, imperfect as it was better than no structure at all. That understanding, Kessel noted in their private log, was beginning to feel less shared. The word no had not broken the council, but it had found the cracks that were already there, and it had applied pressure, precisely and without apology, in exactly the right places. It started with the abstentions. When the security motion came to the floor, a formal resolution authorizing the Council to prepare escalatory response measures against Earth, which was diplomatic language for beginning military planning. The vote should have been routine. It was framed carefully. The language was measured. Grand Arbiter Solène had spent 3 days personally lobbying the smaller delegations. She was confident. The first abstention was from the DHAL, a quiet, mathematically oriented species from a gas giant moon, who had joined the Council 80 years ago and had spent most of that time contributing technical assessments and staying out of political fights. Their delegate stood, announced the abstention in their flat, precise way, and sat back down without further comment. A murmur moved through the chamber. The second abstention was from the Orium, which surprised no one who had been paying attention, and apparently everyone who hadn't. Their delegate, a young female named Tessaval, iridescent-feathered and visibly nervous, stood and said, in the careful, rehearsed galactic standard of someone who had practiced this moment many times, that the Orium delegation did not believe sufficient evidence had been presented to justify escalatory measures, and would therefore abstain pending further review. She sat down to complete silence. The third abstention was from the Vreth. Kessel stood slowly, deliberately. In Vreth culture, there were specific body positions for specific emotional states, and the one Kessel held now, mid-limbs relaxed, primary eyes forward, antenna precisely neutral, was the position for I have thought about this longer than you have and I am not interested in your reaction. They said simply, the Vreth delegation abstains and sat down. 3 abstentions did not stop the motion from passing. It passed, on the strength of the elder votes and several smaller species who voted with the elders out of habit or fear. But 3 abstentions on a security motion of this gravity, from 3 different species, with no prior coordination anyone could prove, sent a message through the chamber that did not need to be spoken. The unified front had just developed visible cracks. After the session, Kessel did not return to the Vreth diplomatic suite immediately. Instead, they took a long, indirect route through the lower corridors of the council complex, a habit they had developed over the years, because the lower corridors were less monitored, and because the longer route gave them time to think in the particular focused silence their species required. They were thinking about Commander Ashares. They had received her acknowledgement of their warning 2 days after sending it, brief, careful, giving away nothing. But it was the acknowledgement itself that mattered. She had received the message, she had understood it, she had not publicized it. She was, Kessel assessed with the careful precision of 30 years of studying humanity, exactly the kind of person that humanity tended to put in the rooms where things actually happened. Not the loudest voice, not the most decorated, the steadiest one. Kessel composed a second message in their head, weighing each word the way a structural engineer weighs load-bearing elements. When they reached their suite, they sat down, wrote it, and sent it before the part of their mind that was still functioning on self-preservation instinct could argue. Commander Reyes, the security motion passed. It will be meaningless. 3 elder delegations are in military planning, but there is deep disagreement on methodology. They have no unified strategy and will not develop one quickly. The more immediate matter, 2 younger species are moving toward Earth independently. You likely already know about the Orium. The DHAL sent an inquiry through a third-party research institution 2 days ago. It was routed carefully, but I intercepted it. These connections will matter more than any military equation. Cultivate them. The Council's strength is not its weapons. It is its appearance of unanimity. That appearance is now broken. Help it stay broken. They sent it. Then they sat in the dark of their suite and waited for the complicated feeling of having just committed to something irreversible to settle into something they could live with. It didn't settle completely, but it settled enough. On Earth, the message landed in Reyes' queue at 03:00 station time, which meant she read it bleary-eyed and cross-legged on her bunk in the Perseverance, and then read it again fully upright with the lights on. She forwarded it immediately, along with her own assessment, which had grown from 1 line to 3. Source is reliable. Information consistent with what we're seeing on open channels. Recommendation: initiate contact with DHAL immediately, formalize the Orium conversation, and have someone find out who the Vreth delegate is because we are going to owe them something significant before this is over. Earth's diplomatic corps moved fast when given clear direction. Within 48 hours, a carefully worded research inquiry was routed to the DHAL scientific institution that had made the original contact, framed as academic, collegial, nothing that could be characterized as political. Within 72 hours, the Orium conversation, which had begun as a single informal exchange, had quietly deepened into something that resembled, without officially being, a dialogue between potential partners. None of this was visible on the surface. None of it would have looked like anything to someone monitoring council official channels. It looked like science. It looked like curiosity. It looked like the unremarkable thing that happens when two species find each other interesting. But underneath, something was being built, carefully, quietly, the way humans had always built their most important things. Inside the military planning sessions that Kessel had warned about, the 3 elder delegations discovered what anyone who had ever tried to plan a war by committee already knew. It was slow, fractious, and prone to collapse under the weight of competing interests. The Vorthaki, elder delegate Emron's people, were cautious. They had lived long enough to know that military action against a species that had just demonstrated absolute psychological composure under pressure was the kind of decision that looked decisive in the short term and disastrous in the long one. Emron himself had privately recommended indefinite pause. He was being ignored by his own hawks, which was a problem he had navigated before. The Lethani, Solen species, wanted overwhelming force deployed immediately to reestablish the precedent of council authority before other young species got ideas. Their military strategists were already running deployment scenarios. The numbers looked favorable on paper. The third elder species, the Karath, enormous, slow-moving beings whose communication style made even their allies impatient, had been in their private deliberation session for 9 days and had not yet reached a consensus on whether the word no was definitionally aggressive or definitionally defensive under the Council's own legal framework. The Lethani were beginning to find this deeply irritating. No unified strategy emerged. No ships were deployed. The clock ran. On the 41st day after the transmission, 11 days past the Council's own stated compliance deadline, the Galactic Council had not taken a single decisive action. Earth had taken 47. Most of them were invisible. Supply chain realignments, diplomatic conversations that didn't look diplomatic, scientific exchanges that weren't only about science. Small, incremental, unglamorous moves, each one individually unremarkable and collectively forming a shape that a certain insectoid delegate on Veth Prime was watching with something that, in Vreth terms, translated approximately as relief. Humanity, Kessel wrote in their log on day 41, did not need to win a confrontation. They needed to outlast one, and they appeared to have grasped this before the confrontation had even formally materialized. They are not fighting the Council, Kessel wrote. They are building the world that comes after it, while the Council argues humanity is already living in the future they intend to create. Outside Kessel's window, Veth Prime's twin moons were rising, both of them bright, both of them cold. In 30 days, everything would change. The Armada left Veth Prime on a clear day in the Council's calendar. Not that the departure was announced clearly, because it was officially characterized as a peacekeeping observation convoy, which was the kind of language that fooled no one but could be cited in legal proceedings later. 217 vessels, 14 different species, led by Lethani Admiral Verk, who had argued against the mission in private and then commanded it with full professionalism, as career officers tended to do. The formation was precise, the mission parameters were defined, and the objective to arrive in the outer Sol system, make their presence visible, and thereby demonstrate that the Council's compliance directive was not a request, was straightforward. The transit took 19 days. What they found was not what their intelligence had led them to expect. Long-range sensor contact was established at 40 AU from Sol, roughly where you'd find the outer edge of the heliosphere, that invisible boundary where the sun's influence gives way to the deeper dark of interstellar space. Standard procedure. Verk's lead sensor officer, a young Lethani named Preth, ran the initial sweep and then ran it again because the first result looked wrong. "Admiral," Preth said, and her tone was the particular even, controlled tone that good officers used when they were actively working against showing alarm. "I'm reading 340 vessels at the heliosphere boundary. Possibly more behind them. The outer sensor return is being partially scattered. I cannot confirm the outer count." Verk was quiet for a moment. "Classification. Terran, all Terran. Mix of designations. I'm seeing classes I don't have in the registry." Preth paused. "They appear to be Class 4 and above. Several appear to be Class 7 or higher. The registry the Council maintained classified human ships up to Class 3, because that was what their filed inventory declared. Class 3 was a competent defensive vessel. Class 7 was a warship. Class 7 and above was not something a civilization 2 centuries into space travel should have been capable of producing in any significant number." Verk stared at the sensor display for a long moment. "Have they moved?" "No, Admiral. They're stationary, holding position at the heliosphere boundary." "Formation." Preth hesitated. Then, with the precision of someone who had studied enough military history to recognize what they were looking at, "Radiant array, Admiral. It's a radiant array." The Lethani officer standing to Verk's left made a sound in the harmonic range that indicated significant distress. Verk understood why. The radiant array was not a defensive formation. It was not a territorial formation. It was an offensive deployment pattern, a three-dimensional geometric spread designed to maximize coverage angles across a wide front, used specifically when a fleet intended to engage a formation that was approaching in a known direction. It was a formation that said, "We knew you were coming, we prepared for you specifically, and we have arranged ourselves to make you understand that." "Are they targeting us?" Verk asked. "No active targeting locks. All weapon systems appear to be offline." Preth looked up. "They're just standing there, Admiral." Verk stood for a long time looking at the display. The Council's armada, 217 ships, a significant force, assembled over weeks, dispatched with confidence, carrying the full moral weight of 47 civilizations. The human fleet at the heliosphere, at minimum 340 vessels, possibly more, arranged in a formation that communicated with perfect clarity, without a single shot fired or a single aggressive word spoken, that they had seen the Council coming from the moment the Armada left Veth Prime. And they had not scrambled to respond. They had not rushed to assemble in a panic. They had been here, positioned, waiting, which meant either they had intelligence that should not have been possible, or their strategic planning operated on a timescale that was deeply uncomfortable to think about. Verk made a decision. "Open a channel," she said. "Civilian frequency, diplomatic band." The channel opened. On the other end, after a brief pause, a human voice responded. Female. Calm. Speaking Galactic Standard with the particular accent of someone who had learned it as a second language and mastered it so thoroughly the origin was almost invisible. "Council Armada, this is Commander HFY Reyes of the United Earth Diplomatic Station Perseverance." A brief pause, and then, this was the part that Verk would remember for the rest of her long life. The voice shifted, just slightly, into something that wasn't hostile, wasn't threatening, but was so completely unintimidated that it constituted its own kind of statement. "You appear to be a long way from Veth Prime. Is everything all right? We noticed you coming about 2 weeks ago, and wanted to make sure you hadn't gotten turned around somewhere." Someone in Verk's command deck made a sound that, if she were being uncharitable, she would have characterized as a suppressed laugh. She was not uncharitable. She was a professional. She maintained her composure. But she felt it too. The exchange that followed lasted 4 hours. Verk was scrupulous. She stuck to the stated mission parameters: observation, presence, encouragement of dialogue. She did not threaten. She did not escalate. She was, by any professional measure, precisely what a senior officer conducting a sensitive diplomatic military mission should be. Reyes was, by any professional measure, infuriatingly pleasant. She expressed polite interest in the Armada's voyage. She asked thoughtful questions about the transit conditions in that region of space. She mentioned, conversationally and without emphasis, that Earth's fleet had been conducting routine exercises in that area for several weeks, which explained the formation, and that they were always glad to see Council vessels, as it provided an excellent opportunity for real-world comparison data on different ship designs. She did not mention the Radiant Array. She did not mention the Class 7 designations. She did not explain how Earth had known the Armada was coming, or when they'd known it, or what they'd done with that knowledge. She simply talked, warmly and at length, about nothing in particular, while 340 ships held their position at the edge of Sol system space, and the Council's 217 vessels sat in a holding pattern, and every sensor officer on every bridge quietly ran their own read of the situation and reached the same conclusion. The humans were not afraid. Not performing confidence, not manufacturing bravado, actually, genuinely, structurally not afraid, in the way that a species is not afraid of something when they have correctly assessed that thing and found it, on careful consideration, manageable. Verk filed her preliminary report to the Council that evening. It was the most difficult report she had ever written, not because it was complex, because it was simple, and the simplicity was the problem. Assessment: human fleet strength significantly exceeds Council intelligence projections. Human tactical preparation suggests advanced early warning capability. Human psychological posture indicates no compliance intention and no apparent concern regarding Council military response. Recommend immediate reassessment of strategic position before any further action. Mission objective, presence demonstration, has been effectively reversed. We have demonstrated their presence to ourselves. She sent it. Then she sat in her command chair in the dark, while her ship hummed around her, and she thought about a species that had spent 200 years in space saying very little and watching everything. And she thought about what they must have seen. On Earth, in a small garden in Shanghai, Dr. Yuan Bao received a notification that the Council Armada had entered the outer Sol system and made contact. He poured himself tea. His comm unit began ringing. He let it ring for a while. In 400 years of Galactic Council history, no delegate had ever addressed the full chamber floor without prior recognition from the chair. It was not simply a procedural rule, it was a cultural absolute. The Council's authority rested on ceremony as much as it rested on power, perhaps more, in the long run, because power could be challenged, but ceremony, when respected long enough, became something close to sacred. You did not break the ceremony. You did not skip the recognition. You did not stand up and simply begin speaking, because to do so was to declare, implicitly, that the ceremony did not apply to you, and if it did not apply to you, the question of why it applied to anyone else became suddenly, dangerously open. Kessel of the Vreth knew all of this. They stood up anyway. The chamber was in the middle of a procedural debate, the kind that lasted hours and changed nothing, when Kessel rose from the Vreth delegation box. Their clerk grabbed their arm instinctively, and Kessel gently but unmistakably removed the clerk's hand. Grand Arbiter Solen noticed immediately. Every senior delegate noticed immediately. The chamber did not go silent right away. It took about 15 seconds for the irregularity to ripple outward through the space, for conversations to pause and eyes to turn, and the accumulated weight of 400 years of protocol to press down on the small insectoid figure standing in delegation box 17. Kessel waited for the silence. They had learned, studying humanity, that silence was a tool, that some messages were delivered most clearly not through what you said first, but through what you made people wait to hear. When the chamber was fully quiet, Kessel spoke. They did not ask for recognition. They did not apologize for the breach. They simply began. What I am about to say is not the position of the Vreth delegation. It is not sanctioned by my government. It is the statement of one individual who has spent 30 years studying a species this council has catastrophically misunderstood, and who has decided that the cost of silence is now higher than the cost of speaking. The chamber remained silent, not the silence of compliance, the silence of an entire room making the collective decision to hear what came next before deciding how to react to the breach. Even Solène, whose authority had just been publicly sidestepped, held still, because she was, before anything else, someone who had survived 400 years of politics by knowing when a moment was bigger than her response to it. Kessel took a breath, and then, for 47 minutes, they spoke. They did not begin with humanity. They began with the council. They spoke about what the council had been built to do, to provide structure, mediation, and protection to emerging species navigating a complex and dangerous galaxy. They spoke about what the council had, over centuries, gradually become, not a protector of emerging species, but a regulator of them. A body whose primary function had drifted, almost without anyone noticing, from support to control. And they named, specifically and without euphemism, the mechanism through which that control was maintained, the compliance directive, not the specific directive issued to Earth, the system. The recurring pattern of issuing ultimatums to young civilizations at a specific stage of their development, precisely when they were strong enough to be a threat but not yet confident enough, historically, to refuse. The chamber stirred. Several elder delegates were already preparing objections. Kessel moved past them faster. They turned to mathematics. I will not speak to morality, they said. I will speak to arithmetic. 30 years ago, human technological development was at a rate that placed them in council membership range within 2 centuries. 20 years ago, that projection shortened to 1 century. 10 years ago, following several crises in their own political history that functioned as accelerants rather than setbacks, the projection shortened again. I will now show you the current projection. They had prepared the display in advance, which was either further evidence of premeditation or further evidence of thorough preparation, depending on who was assessing it. The numbers appeared on the chamber's central display. Humanity's projected technological equivalence with the Council's median member civilization, not in 1 century, not in 50 years. 11 years. 11 standard galactic years at current rates, and humanity would be operating at parity with the average council member state in every measurable domain: military, scientific, industrial, and economic. The silence that followed was different from the previous silence. The previous silence had been waiting. This silence was realization. The window during which a compliance directive could have functioned as intended, Kessel continued, closed before the directive was written. We did not issue this ultimatum to a young species. We issued it to a civilization that, by the time our message arrived, had already outpaced the assumptions on which the message was based. We asked them to comply. They said no. And we are sitting here, weeks later, debating escalatory options against a species that, I will say this precisely, does not need our permission to exist. They paused. The question before this council is not whether humanity will comply. They will not. The question is whether the council will pretend, for the sake of its own authority, that this situation is recoverable through force. And I am asking that question because I know what force against humanity would cost. Not because their fleet is larger than ours, though it may be. Not because their weapons are more powerful, though some of them are. But because a species that spent 10,000 years fighting itself, and emerged unified, does not respond to force the way other species do. Another pause. It does not break, it learns. The chamber was very still. Every conflict in human history that was initiated by an outside power with the expectation of quick resolution instead became the founding story of human resilience. They have a word for it, several words in several languages: resistance, defiance, survival. They tell these stories to their children. They name their ships after these moments. They build monuments to them. Kessel's voice, which had been measured throughout, allowed itself one small shift toward something rawer. I have read their history. I have read it carefully. I would not want to be the civilization that appears in the next chapter of it as the one that tried to break them. They stopped. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Grand Arbiter Solen, in a voice that was careful and very controlled, said, "The delegate from the Vreth delegation will be formally censured for breach of protocol." "I understand," Kessel said, and then, with the particular composure of someone who has already paid the price in their own mind and found it acceptable, "I ask the Council to note, in the formal record, that the censure was issued and that I stand by every word regardless." They sat down. The speech moved through the Council complex the way significant things do. Not officially, because officially it was being treated as a procedural irregularity, but through every informal channel, every aid conversation, every species whose translation matrix had captured the words and carried them back to delegation suites, where junior staff read them aloud to senior delegates who had stepped out for the session's recess. Elder Delegate Emran of the Vorthaki received a transcript within an hour. He read it once, in the way of someone who did not need to read things twice. Then he called his senior aide and gave two instructions. The first, draft a formal communication to the Vreth delegation expressing the Vorthaki's collegial respect for the delegate's perspective, to be filed on the record. The second, arrange a private meeting between himself and Kessel for the following morning, unofficial, no aides. The aide asked what the meeting would be about. Emran considered the question. "The future," he said. "We have been very focused lately on the present. I think it's time to discuss the future." 3 days after Kessel's speech, the Lethani formally submitted a revised military proposal to the Security Committee. It was withdrawn by its own submitters 40 minutes later, after a private communication from one of the other elder delegations whose contents were never made public. No new military proposal was submitted to replace it. The Council Armada, still holding position at the edge of the Sol system, received revised orders. Maintain position, take no action, await further instruction. Verk acknowledged the orders with professional brevity, and privately told her first officer that she had never been more relieved to be told to do nothing in her career. In Delegation Box 17, Kessel sat through their formal censure, proceeding with their mid-limbs folded in the posture their species used for "I have already decided I was right." And on Earth, Dr. Yuan Bao read a transcript of the speech, forwarded to him by Daniar Sate Kali with a single-line note that said, "I think you should read this," and sat with it for a long time. Then he wrote back. "They have a historian," he wrote. "We should find out who they are and what books they've been reading." The formal meeting between Commander Asha Reyes and the Council's diplomatic envoy was scheduled 3 times and cancelled twice. The first cancellation came from the Council's side, a procedural objection about venue. The second came from Earth, a security review that turned out to be legitimate and not, as the Council suspected, a power play. The third scheduling held. The location was neutral ground, a station called Midpoint, positioned equidistant between the heliosphere boundary and the nearest Council relay outpost, a place built for exactly this kind of meeting, 2 parties who needed to talk and had not yet decided how much they trusted each other. It was functional and deliberately unimpressive. Gray corridors, fluorescent lighting equivalents. Conference rooms with chairs designed to accommodate multiple biologies adequately and none of them comfortably, which was, someone had decided when building the place, probably appropriate. The envoy's name was Thessaly, a Lethani like Solen, but younger, perhaps 150 years old by their reckoning, which put them in an interesting position of being junior enough to be sent on a mission like this and senior enough to be taken seriously. They arrived with 2 aides and a security officer. Reyes arrived alone. They sat across from each other at a table designed for 6, which meant there was more space between them than strictly necessary, which was either a diplomatic accident or a carefully made point. Thessaly opened, as envoys did with formalities. The Council's official position, restated. The framework of the discussion. The parameters of what could and could not be agreed to at this level. It was done correctly, fluently, and with the mechanical precision of someone who had rehearsed it many times and was performing it now primarily because not performing it would have been its own statement. Reyes listened. She had the particular quality of attention that made people feel heard without giving anything away, a quality that Thessaly, despite themselves, noted and catalogued. When the formalities were finished, Thessaly paused, and then did something that was either a calculated diplomatic maneuver or a genuine moment of an individual breaking through the function of their role. They set aside the prepared notes. They folded their hands on the table. "May I ask you something?" they said, not officially. Reyes waited. "Why that word?" Thessaly said. "We have analyzed the response extensively. Every senior diplomat on the Council has had a position on it, but I would like to hear it from you. Not why Earth said no, I have heard the strategic explanations. I mean why that word, why not a counteroffer, why not silence, why not a longer statement, why one word and why that one?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport at the end of the conference room, space was doing what space always did, being enormous and silent and completely indifferent to the small dramas being conducted within it. "Do you know what a door is?" Reyes said finally. Thessaly indicated yes, they were familiar with the concept. "A door closed is different from a door locked," Reyes said. "A locked door is a challenge. It says you can't come in, which immediately raises the question of how you might anyway. It's combative, it's an obstacle." She paused. "A closed door just says this room is not available. It doesn't invite you to try the handle. It doesn't suggest there's something worth forcing your way to. It's just closed, completely, finitely, with no drama attached." She looked at Thessaly steadily. "We chose no because no is a closed door. It's not a threat. It's not a declaration. It's not the beginning of a longer conversation about terms and conditions. It's the end of a specific conversation, the one where we discuss whether we comply, delivered as cleanly and completely as we could manage." She paused. "We didn't want to posture. We didn't want to escalate. We wanted to communicate one thing with absolute clarity. This particular conversation is over. If you want to have a different conversation, you know where we are." Thessaly was quiet. "That's what I thought," they said finally, in a tone that suggested the answer had confirmed something they had suspected and not wanted to be right about. "What did you think?" Reyes asked. "That you weren't angry," Thessaly said. "That's what disturbed the Council most, I think, though they wouldn't say so. Anger we understand. Fear we understand. Pride we understand. But you were calm, as if this was not an extraordinary situation for you, as if you had been in this room before." Reyes thought about Dr. Bao, about 60 years of studying ultimatums, about 22 minutes that changed a vote. "We have been," she said simply, "many times, different room, same conversation." Thessaly absorbed this. "May I tell you something not officially?" they said. "Please," Reyes said. "There is a faction within the Council not small that wanted to see fear in your response. Wanted to see you reach for something more elaborate, more defensive, because an elaborate defense suggests anxiety, and anxiety suggests vulnerability, and vulnerability is the thing that makes a compliance directive make sense." They paused. "What you sent instead was the response of a species that was not afraid, not performing confidence, not overcompensating, simply not afraid." Another pause. "Do you understand what that communicated to every species in the galaxy that received that transmission?" Reyes waited. "It communicated that there was no version of this situation in which humanity would be afraid of the Galactic Council," Thessaly said. "And that is a different kind of statement than anything you could have written at length, because length implies you needed to convince us. One word implies you didn't care whether we were convinced." Reyes nodded slowly. "We've had a lot of practice," she said, "at being the smaller thing in the room, and we've learned something from it." "What?" "That the smaller thing in the room is never actually small," she said. "It's just not finished yet." They talked for 4 more hours after that. Not about compliance, not about military positions, not about the Armada still sitting at the heliosphere boundary like an awkward guest who'd stayed too long. They talked about history, Lethani history, human history, the places where the shapes of those histories rhymed in ways that neither species had expected. They talked about what the Council had been and what it had become, and whether those two things were reconcilable. They talked about the Vreth delegate's speech, which Thessaly had read 3 times and which Reyes had read twice and shared with Dr. Bao. They talked about what No could open, now that it had closed what it had closed. By the end, the untouched notes from the opening formalities were still sitting on the table between them, and neither of them had looked at them in 3 hours. Thessaly stood to leave. At the door, they turned back. I was asked to come here and assess whether Earth could be brought to the table on modified compliance terms, they said. I will be reporting that they cannot, and that the modified compliance framework should be retired entirely, and that what the Council actually needs is a different kind of conversation. A pause. I expect this report will not be well received. Probably not, Reyes agreed. No, Thessaly said and smiled, a Lethani smile which involved the secondary eyelids rather than the mouth, but which Reyes had learned to read. I chose that word deliberately, you'll notice. Reyes grinned. I noticed, she said. The Galactic Council did not fall. Let that be said clearly, because history has a way of dramatizing institutional change into something sharper and cleaner than it ever actually is. The Council did not collapse. It did not shatter. There was no single decisive moment of fracture, no battle, no ultimatum returned, no dramatic chamber scene where the old order dissolved and the new one stood blinking in its place. What happened was slower, messier, and in the long view more permanent. The Council changed. It started with resignations. Not dramatic ones, not accompanied by speeches. Just 3 senior delegates from elder civilizations who, within the space of 6 weeks, cited personal reasons and stepped back from their seats. Their replacements were younger, less invested in the architecture of the previous 4 centuries, more willing to ask whether the structure they were inheriting was the structure they wanted to maintain. Grand Arbiter Solène herself did not resign. She served out the remainder of her term with the particular dignity of someone who understood they were watching the world reorganize around them, and had decided that the most useful thing they could do was make the reorganization as orderly as possible. She would later write, in her private memoirs, that the day she received humanity's response was the day she understood the Council had become something it was not supposed to be. She did not say this publicly. She said it to her grandson, and her grandson included it in the biography he wrote 30 years later, and it became one of the most quoted sentences in the history of that era. We built a wall and called it a ceiling, and we were surprised when the species underneath it did not look up in awe. The formal restructuring was proposed by Emran of the Vorthaki, which surprised almost everyone, because Emran was old and elder, and the very embodiment of the order being reformed. He proposed it quietly in committee without fanfare, as if the idea were obvious and the only question was when someone sensible would get around to statting it. The compliance directive system was retired, not just the specific directive against Earth, but the mechanism itself, struck from Council operational protocol after 400 years of use. In its place, a new framework, the Contact Accord. Young species entering the galactic community would be offered partnership and information, not governance and oversight. Membership in the Council would be by application and mutual agreement, not by assignment. It passed. Not unanimously. Nothing in the Council passed unanimously, because unanimity required that someone was being silenced. But it passed with a margin that would have been unthinkable 8 months earlier. Kessel's censure was formally struck from the record 2 weeks after the vote. No ceremony attended this. It simply disappeared from the official documentation, which was the Council's way of saying that didn't happen in a manner that everyone understood to mean we know it happened, and we know we were wrong. Kessel received a private message from Elder Delegate Emran the same day. You spoke first, it said. The ones who speak first carry the cost. The ones who come after carry the credit. History remembers both, but not equally. I want you to know that I know which category you are in. Kessel read it several times. Then they filed it in the same folder where they kept their notes on human history, the 30 years of reading and watching, and learning the shape of a species that nobody else had bothered to understand. It seemed, they thought, like the right place for it. Humanity was offered a permanent seat on the Galactic Council 6 months after the restructuring vote. The invitation was extended formally, through proper channels, with all the appropriate ceremony. It arrived addressed to the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, rather than the human collective Sol system, third planet, which was a small change and a significant one. Earth accepted. The acceptance was 3 sentences long, considerably more than 1 word, which was noted by several delegates with something approaching humor. Commander HFY Reyes was appointed Earth's first permanent council representative. She arrived at Veth Prime on a ship called the UEDS Bow, named at the quiet suggestion of someone in the diplomatic corps who had read her reports and understood the debt. She wore Earth's dress uniform, deep navy, gold trim, the small flag of every nation that had ever existed stitched into the lining of the collar in thread too fine to see except up close. The ceremony was long, as council ceremonies always were. 47 species in full formal delegation, speeches in 23 languages, the kind of orchestrated solemnity that took years to plan and hours to execute. Reyes stood through all of it with the patience of someone who understood that ritual mattered, that the things people chose to make formal were the things they intended to remember. Afterward, at the reception, she moved through the room with the particular ease of someone who had been learning people her whole life. She shook hands that had no hands. She exchanged the compound eye acknowledgement with Vreth delegates who had practiced theirs specifically for this occasion. She spent 20 minutes in conversation with Elder Delegate Emran, who was the oldest individual in the room and the most interesting, and who spoke about the galaxy with the particular wistfulness of someone who had seen most of it and still found it surprising. "You know what I have been thinking about," Emran said, near the end of their conversation, "since all of this began." "What?" Reyes asked. "Your word," he said, "the single word. I've been thinking what it cost to send it, not strategically, personally. Whoever sat at that console and transmitted it into the dark, not knowing for certain how we would respond." He paused. "That is not a comfortable position to sit in." "No," Reyes said. And yet, she agreed. Emran looked at her for a long moment with the careful attention of 900 years of life behind his eyes. "You are a very strange species," he said. "I mean that in the best possible sense. I have lived long enough to have seen most kinds of beings. I have not seen your kind before." "We're an acquired taste," Reyes said. He made the Vorthaki equivalent of a laugh, a low vibration in his chest that his translator rendered as warm static. "Yes, I think that is right." He moved to leave, then paused. "Take good care of it," he said, gesturing at the room, the chamber beyond all of it. "We built it badly, but the idea behind it is worth keeping." "We know," Reyes said. "We're good at taking things that were built badly and making them work." He nodded. "Yes," he said very quietly. "I know, that is what frightened us about you." Later, much later, when the ceremony was done and the delegations had dispersed, and the lights in the great chamber had been dimmed to maintenance level, Reyes stood alone at the viewport in her new office. The office that would belong to Earth's representative, permanently, going forward, and looked out at Veth Prime's night sky. Different stars than Earth's, different constellations, different densities, different colors at the edges, but stars still, the same physics, the same ancient light. A young aide appeared at her door, an Orium, iridescent feathered, nervous in the way of all young people given their first serious posting. "Commander Representative Reyes, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say," the aide stopped, started again. "I grew up learning about the compliance directive response. In school, it was already in our curriculum by the time I was a student." A pause. We were taught that it was the moment the council had to decide what it actually believed about the galaxy. Reyes turned from the viewport. What did your teachers say it believed? The aide thought about it. That the old belief was the galaxy is organized. There are levels. Young species are below, old species are above, and the job of the old is to manage the young until they're ready. Another pause. And the new belief, the one we have now, is that the galaxy isn't organized. It's just full of different things at different stages, none of which have the right to tell the others where they belong. Reyes smiled. That's a pretty good summary, she said. What would you say it believed? Reyes considered the viewport, the stars, the 900 years of Emron's eyes, the 47 minutes of Kessel's voice, the 4 hours of Thessaly's honesty, the 22 minutes of Bao's history, the one word transmitted on a Tuesday from a small station by a woman with cold coffee and steady hands. I'd say, she said, that the galaxy learned something it should have known already, that the size of something in space has nothing to do with the size of what's inside it. The aide considered this for a moment. Then they nodded, with the solemn gravity of someone very young encountering something they will carry for a long time. Good night, Representative Reyes. Good night, she said. The door closed softly. Outside, the stars of Veth Prime burned cold and bright and ancient. Inside, humanity had arrived. End.